could we say, okay, don't try anything too novel and crazy without easing into it? Could we also perhaps...
But I would say that goes for anybody, quite frankly.
Okay. Could we also say perhaps find the movements that you can do without injury and just keep doing those over and over? Is there any evidence that mixing up the exercises is important, meaning doing new movements? Or if you find 2 or 3 movements that work well for you, can you just stick with those and just work on progressive overload?
I think you can stick with those. I think, muscle, the whole concept of muscle confusion, muscle knows tension and how long it's under that tension and for how many sets it's under that tension. It's not like, well, I can tell that this is an incline bench press versus an incline dumbbell. I mean, you might move through different ranges of motion and whatnot, but the tension on the muscle is the tension on the muscle. So what I'd say to people is, I think most people probably change up things too much because there is like a neurological adaptation to doing a specific exercise where you get stronger at it. And so now you're using more load, you can create more mechanical tension. But if you're always changing things up, you might not take advantage of that full, kind of neurological adaptation. But if you're always doing the same exercises, it's too easy to get comfortable and fall into, well, today I do 3 sets of 10 and I always do 3 sets of 10 and I use this weight and that's what I do. And now you're no longer progressively overloading. So I think there has to be a balance between enough changing of exercises to kind of promote some novelty, because as you know, novelty, there's a reward center in the brain for that, just changing something. And think about anytime you're going to try a new workout, you get a little excited about it. When I was going to try Zach's way of training, 3 years ago, I was like, I was very, very excited about it, So I think there is a place for that, but I think people tend to fall into a little bit too much of doing the same thing over and over or constantly changing things because they're always chasing that novelty. And I think that the reality is probably somewhere in the middle. But specifically for over 50, I think whatever you can do with low pain level and be consistent with that you enjoy, that's what's best for you. I mean, I always tell this story. I had a client who they loved CrossFit. They loved doing CrossFit. And they said, I want to build muscle. And I know it's not the best workout for building muscle. I said, it might be for you, because if you hate bodybuilding training and you're not motivated to go do it and you don't enjoy it, you're probably not going to work hard at it. And so maybe for you, a CrossFit workout is the best muscle building workout, because if I try to get you to do something else, you'd hate it and would lose motivation.
Right. And it feeds back to that consistency principle that you talked about before.
Exactly. So when we look at I think this might be interesting for some of your listeners. So when we look at how much muscle you can build after a certain age, you can build the same amount of muscle as a percentage of your starting skeletal muscle mass. Okay. So what I mean by that is once you're 50, 60, you've usually lost some muscle. Okay. And if you've never lifted before, if you go into lift as a percentage basis, it appears that you will still gain the same amount of lean mass. But for example, if somebody has 80 kilos of starting lean, most of your podcast listeners are USA, I assume. So let's say somebody has 150 pounds of lean mass when they start, just throwing out a random number, and they gain 10% over a couple of years. Now they have 165 pounds of lean mass. They've gained 15 pounds, but the percentage is 10. If somebody starts and they have 20 pounds of lean mass, 10% of that is 12 pounds. They gained an absolute less amount, but as a percentage, it was similar or same. And we actually see that with women too. Women actually develop as a percentage of their starting lean mass the same percentage increase in lean mass as men when they do the same level of hard training. So what I tell people I'll hear people say, well, I'm too old to start resistance. No. Now is the perfect time to start, right now. And honestly, it doesn't take a huge dose. I mean, if you want to be go get into powerlifting and compete at competition, yeah, now it takes a bigger dose, right? But what it takes to get, and I'm just going to throw a number out, 80%, the majority of the benefits for health, strength, resistance training, you could probably get in 3-4 sessions of 30 to 40 minutes. You don't have to have a huge input of time. And just look at the depression study we talked about. Obviously, that's not like muscle and strength, but to sessions of 25 minutes. I mean, it is a absurdly low dose that you require. And I think a lot of people, I try to be careful about this too, will see how I train, which is 2-3 hours a day for 5 days a week, and think that's what's needed. No, that's what I want to go win a world championship. That's what's needed for that. It's not needed for you to build muscle and get stronger. And even when I was at grad school, across the street, they did a study in frail elderly where they had them, basically they had trouble like standing up from a seated position. And by the end of a 12-week study of them like progressively overloading them, which was basically like them just lowering the seat at first, right? And then maybe adding like a little bit of weight, they saw these people built muscle, built bone, got healthier, better quality of life. And these are people in their 70s. And there was a study in Australia that actually got on the news. Peter Attia talked about it with elderly women who I think they were above age 70. And there's some of them in there deadlifting like 150, upper hundreds in deadlift, you know? It's incredible how I took a class called Skeletal Muscle Structure, Function, and Plasticity. Your skeletal muscle is so adaptable. It is such an adaptable tissue. It's amazing. The same thing that can allow somebody to squat, Jesus Oliveira, shout out, squat over 1,000 pounds is the same tissue that can allow somebody to run 100 miles like David Goggins. Think about that. That's really incredibly adaptive. And so what I'll tell to people, regardless of your age, your sex, whatever demographic you are in, resistance training for just a couple times a week for a short period of time will drastically improve the prospects of your quality of life, your longevity. I mean, if we look at hand grip strength, we look at lean mass, they're all inversely associated with mortality, especially the older you get, becomes a stronger association. And I always tell people, I'm like, it's not about the hand grip strength. This is a proxy for just strength overall, right? There was a study where they looked at push-ups and found push-ups were inversely associated with mortality. It's not that doing push-ups is magic. It's that is a proxy for that person being strong. And we focus so much of our attention, especially like on falls in the elderly, right? Of, well, if they had more bone mass, they wouldn't break their bones. What if they didn't fall in the first place because they were strong enough and had good enough gait and balance to catch themselves? And oh, by the way, nothing better for increasing bone mass than resistance training. So I am a huge fan of, and then we already talked about like the metabolic, like skeletal muscle. Gabrielle touched on it. It was one of the first things Don Lehman said when I came in his lab. He goes, skeletal muscle fits every definition of an organ. And we don't talk about it like an organ. We talk about it like it's this inert tissue that just sits there. And it is not. It sends out signals to other tissues. It integrates signals from other tissues. It is an endocrine organ. And so many people have unhealthy skeletal muscle. And if we treat it, and what happens when you resistance train? What happens when you build muscle? Muscle is a metabolic sink. It is greedy, right? It's sucking up. It's incredible. You could take people who are type 2 diabetic, and if you get them on a slight calorie deficit, you get them to start exercising, it is incredible how fast their blood markers will start to resolve. Like they can still be obese and you'll see their blood markers start to resolve within, like you'll see improvements in weeks. Lehman did I want to say a 16-week study in either diabetic or pre-diabetic women back in like 2003, I want to say. And he said within 4 weeks, he said, we already saw these blood markers start to resolve. Like your HbA1c hasn't resolved, but a lot of these other markers start to resolve because at a fundamental level, at least in my opinion, and other metabolism people may disagree, I'm a big fan of Occam's razor, which is plainly stated, all things being equal, the simplest explanation is typically true. The actual hardcore scientific definition is the hypothesis that requires the least amount of assumptions is usually true. You're putting in so much energy into a system and you're running out of places to put it. So you have skeletal muscle mass, you have liver, these other tissues in the periphery, and then you have adipose tissue. And did you know that actually so people who have more adipocytes are actually more resistant to type 2 diabetes? So they have more smaller fat cells that can soak up more of this stuff And since type 2 diabetes is basically too much glucose in the blood, right, and a lack of insulin sensitivity, small adipocytes are more insulin sensitive. And so what happens is at least in adipocyte physiology, we used to think of adipose as also an inert tissue, and now we know that's not true either.
And lots of different cell types.
Yes,
we used to just think that there was,
it's heterogeneous.
brown, beige, and white fat cells, and subcutaneous and intravisceral. And now they've done, sequencing of different white fat cells, and like 25, probably now 50 different genetics among those cells that respond differently to insulin. I mean, fat is a very interesting and heterogeneous tissue. Yeah.
But most fat cells, at least based on the literature I've read, and again, I'm happy to have somebody correct me who's an expert in this, but they can expand to a certain point where it really becomes difficult for them to get bigger. The integrity of the cell, because you still got a cell wall, plasma membrane, everything, and you have an extracellular matrix that is scaffolding this fat tissue onto your body. And so at a certain size of adipocyte, it basically becomes, you just can't pack any more in there, okay? And so if you can't put any more in muscle because you're not active and muscle's not moving and churning through substrate, and you can't pack any more into adipose, where does it wind up? It's in your blood. You can't get, and now when your blood levels it's interesting because there are some people who have all these theories about, like one person, a researcher was like, well, I think branched chain amino acids actually cause insulin resistance because we see them elevated in the blood in type 2 diabetes. And I was actually I was a grad student watching this person present, and I put my hand up. I said, "Isn't everything elevated in the blood in type 2 diabetes? Why are we picking on branched chain amino acids?" So you do have some people who can become type 2 diabetic who aren't obese. They tend to have not as many fat cells, which sounds like it'd be an advantage. And if you're if you are not overeating, right, and getting enough exercise in, it probably is an advantage because you have less overall fat mass. But you are going to reach that critical mass of an adipocyte of about 100 microns, I think it is, faster because your overall fat cell number. So at the same fat mass, your fat cells are bigger, and bigger fat cells are less insulin sensitive. In fact, one of the treatments for type 2 diabetes, sulfonylureas, I think they're called, they're PPAR gamma agonists. They actually increase the production of fat cells. They create new small fat cells. Now you have a place to put stuff, and you lower your blood glucose. So it's
a reservoir.
Exactly. And I'm overgeneralizing to be sure. And again, I hope if I've butchered anything, somebody will come in and correct me.
They will.
But what's amazing is this stuff in the blood, you just got to get stuff moving. Because you start doing exercise, start controlling your calories a little bit. Guess what? You're oxidizing things through the Krebs cycle. You're going through glycolysis. You can now start to pull things in, right? You're using this substrate. You can start to pull things in. And because you're pulling things in, now adipose can start to release some of its free fatty acids into the blood, or some of its triacylglycerides into free fatty acids into the bloodstream, which can also facilitate this muscle. So using muscle, it is a partitioning effect, and it doesn't take long to start lowering this glucose, blood lipids, these things in the blood. It can actually resolve, at least those markers can start resolving themselves pretty quickly, which is why, when we look at weight loss, what level of weight loss they say is clinically relevant, it's only 5%, right? Which you'll have obese people and they'll say, well, 5% weight loss, you see these big benefits in like blood lipids and metabolic health. You wouldn't think with just 5% weight loss you would get that, but you do because you're just giving a little bit of space to get that stuff in the blood out. Now, again, I want to be very clear. This is not a proven thing. I feel pretty strongly that this explains a lot. But again, this is my personal opinion about how these diseases develop and whatnot. But I think it's relatively simple.
Yeah, thinking about muscle as an organ, thinking about feeding muscle. We talked about that earlier. thinking about moving muscle and in particular training for strength, resistance training of different kinds. Hypertrophy, yes, but I'm kind of giving it a little bit of a biased vote for more strength training out there across the population for the longevity reasons. I mean, Peter Attia has pointed out that the percentage of people who die after a fall, not because of the fall itself, but because of a hip injury or a wrist injury, and then they go immobile, or they're just not exercising as much anymore, then they get an infection, and then it cascades. In fact, I had a conversation with one of my parents recently on their 79th birthday. I said, in the next 5-10 years, your biggest risk is probably going to be going downstairs or stepping off a curb, not going up, but as Peter's pointed out, going down. So that eccentric movement, being able to sustain a fall, being able to not fall, to catch yourself, so to speak.
Well, and practically you fall farther going downstairs than you do going upstairs.
Up. Exactly. Yeah. And that pattern of falling while going down precedes a lot of infections and that end up deadly, right? So, hats off to Peter for really pointing out the relationship between those things, and to you for encouraging people to strength train. Also, I love the idea that I don't have to go to failure if I'm in strength training, because I like training heavy, but the training to the point where the muscles are quaking. Yeah. Even though that's how I initially started training, because I came up in the Mike Mentzer camp, I actually find that it eats into my recovery in a way that maybe is a little more subtle but meaningful, nonetheless, which is that I feel fatigued later in the day. Whereas if I complete a training session where I can complete every rep, I notice I don't get into that quaking thing. I actually have a lot of mental and physical energy later in the day.
And it's psychologically and emotionally fatiguing as well.
Maybe this one could be out of a brief answer, or maybe not. I don't know. Are there true age-related changes in metabolism that are independent of decline in muscle mass? I saw a paper, I think it was published in Science a few years ago, that said that metabolism actually doesn't slow that much as we age. Of course, total muscle mass.
So you mean BMR?
BMR,
okay.
Basal metabolic rate. In general, I should just say up until that paper came out, I thought, okay, as we get older, our quote-unquote metabolism slows. Then, of course, we have to remember that puberty and childhood is sort of like being on performance-enhancing drugs, in the sense that protein synthesis is just massive and ongoing. But let's just say from age 30 onward, let's say between 30 and 80, assuming that somebody's doing things to maintain muscle mass, is there any reason to believe that their basal metabolic rate actually goes down just as a function of age?
Yeah, you're citing the work from Herman Ponzer, and really great lab looking at energy expenditure. That he does a lot of great stuff. And so that study was looking at several thousand people, I think, looking at their total daily energy expenditure, and really found it's pretty flat from like age 20 to age 70. And then it kind of starts to go down, but you can tie it to the loss of lean mass. And same thing for basal metabolic rate when they do indirect telemetry. If you look at, and this goes for older people, also women versus men, and then also type 2 diabetics versus non-type 2 diabetics, obese versus non-obese. I think the number is like over 80% of the variance in BMR is completely explained by the lean mass, by the amount of lean mass somebody has. And by the way, the last 20% probably is explained by where that lean mass occurs, because liver, for example, is a more metabolically active tissue gram per gram than pretty much any other tissue. Skeletal muscle is more metabolically active than fat tissue, but for a lean tissue is actually somewhat like metabolically slow because its turnover rate is only like 2% per day.
You just have a lot of it.
Yeah, right. But on an absolute amount of calories you burn a lot in muscle because you have so much of it. Right. Great point. So things like gut, liver tissues per gram of tissue are very active. So yeah, there just doesn't seem to be for a long time. We spent so much time focused on the metabolism side of things when we're looking at aging, when we're looking at obesity, and we just didn't really find impressive stuff. Even so, obese people don't have slower metabolisms on average. The research shows that actually, on an absolute basis, they're faster than people who are normal weight. When you standardize for lean mass, it ends up being about the same. People who are type 2 diabetic, same thing. When you standardize for lean mass, if anything, they have a little bit faster BMR. And so if you think about it, it actually kind of makes a little bit of sense on a biochemical level, because if you're insulin resistant, you're also insulin resistant in fat tissue, right? So Okay. So it makes sense that maybe you like waste some more energy because you're not able to put it where you want to put it, right? So the people get upset about this because like, oh no, it's got to be metabolism. And then GLP-1 mimetics have really kind of shown, no, the answer to this question is very much on the appetite side of things. It's like we tried to make a bunch of different drugs that would increase metabolism. We tried to do all these things to increase metabolism, and nothing seemed to really make a big difference. And then we came out with the most powerful appetite suppressants in the history of mankind, and people are losing large amounts of weight and keeping it off. So I think, people got too focused on that metabolism side, or what I hear a lot of is from like postmenopausal women. I'll hear somebody say, my metabolism dropped. What probably happened, you're sleeping less, you're more stressed, you don't feel as good because the hormonal changes, you don't feel as good. And so you spontaneously became less physically active and didn't realize it because our NEAT, like our non-exercise activity thermogenesis, our non-purposeful physical activity that we do, fidgeting, pacing, is actually a large portion of our daily energy expenditure. And people get this wrong. You can't make yourself do more NEAT because then it's just exercise. If you're purposefully doing it, it's exercise. It's
Bouncing your knee.
It's all subconscious, right? But if you're not sleeping as well and you're feeling worse, spontaneously, you'll just not move as much. And I know that people that feels like there's like a lot of judgment and shame associated with that, but it is the truth. It is a practical limitation, and it may not be metabolism. I guess I'm a little bit pedantic with that, but it still contributes to your overall energy expenditure. And so again, they've looked at this, and there is some evidence that like if your estrogen drops and you replace that with supplemental estrogen, that can like help out with like maybe 50 to 100 calorie energy expenditure per day. So if you're replacing something that's like now clinically low.
But my guess is that it would also drive more activity, feeling better, more activity, sleeping better, more activity.
And that's where it's hard to disconnect that, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think metabolism-wise, the results ended up being pretty underwhelming for all this stuff that we just assumed, well, if somebody's overweight, it's because they're slow metabolism. The research didn't pan that out. But I still think it was very interesting. And again, it speaks to like the power of the mind and the connection in the mind of how some of these drugs act. But I do tell people when they say, well, calorie deficit didn't work for me. And I obviously my metabolism was messed up because, I had to get on Ozempic to lose weight. I'm like, well, it doesn't really do anything to metabolism. Like the speed of your metabolism. What happened is you no longer mindlessly snack. You feel you are now in touch with your satiety signals. And that's why you're losing weight. And that's why these drugs, they work.
All right. So speaking of Ozempic, Mounjaro, and similar, let's talk about these drugs that are reducing appetite and, in fairness, have allowed millions of people to lose substantial amounts of weight and keep it off. This topic tends to get people a little bit riled up on social media because I think for some reason people believe that if one gives these drugs the nod, you're essentially saying you don't need to exercise. But I didn't see anywhere or hear anywhere that the use of any compound, drug or otherwise, is mutually exclusive with taking good care of oneself in other ways too. So what are your thoughts on these compounds and what you're seeing out there?
I think my take is pretty balanced on this, which is I think they appear to be great tools for people reducing their intake and reducing body fat. And it functions through appetite. I mean, these drugs are GLP-1 mimetics. And so GLP-1 is a hormone secreted by the gut in response to feeding, and it acts on the gut as well as the brain to reduce appetite, slow motility. So it's a satiety hormone, essentially. Now, it has a very short half-life in the body. So the reason a lot of people will come out and say, well, there's things you can do naturally to increase your GLP-1. This is like talking about, yes, a BB gun fires a projectile and a tank fires a projectile, but there's a pretty big difference, right? So with GLP-1 mimetics, what's happening is they're taking that protein and changing out some of the amino acids in that protein and it basically just gives a much longer half-life. That's why people can take it, once a week or whatever it is, because it just stays around much longer. And so if you think about the food environment we live in, which is free access to cheap, hyper-palatable foods, our brains, for the most part, are probably not equipped to regulate appetite in that environment. And it really actually is kind of incredible how resilient the human body is, because if you look at when the obesity crisis started, we already had ultra-processed foods available. We had cakes, cookies, all these sorts of things. But the difference was you had to go to the bakery and get it. Or there had to be some small barrier, right? And then, I think kind of the barrier that got flipped was basically now, in the last 30 years, you can go anywhere and get access to cheap, ultra-processed, hyper-palatable, calorically dense foods. And they just don't have the same effect on satiety that normal food does, where, like in Kevin Hall's study at NIH, where they took people from a minimally processed diet and switched them to an ultra-processed diet, and they spontaneously increased their caloric intake by 500 calories a day, like overnight. That may sound like not a big deal to some people listening. That is a very big deal.
It's about a pound of per week of increase in body weight.
Yeah, I mean,
assuming
that there's no increase in energy expenditure, which we know happens over time. But with these GLP-1 mimetics, they're slowing down motility. They're acting on the hypothalamus. They're reducing appetite. And it's a very powerful effect. Now, some of the side effects are like nausea. Some people reported kind of like not freezing, but like too slow motility, essentially. So there's some GI side effects, which are kind of to be expected with something like this. And on one side, you've got, it's so funny how everything gets politicized these days. But on one side, you've got people saying, oh, these drugs have no side effects whatsoever. And, heck, I think everybody should be on GLP-1s because we're not made to live in this food environment. And then on the other side, you got people saying, well, this just obliterates the need for hard work and these people don't take accountability. And I don't really think either of those messages are really useful. I think there's a lot of nuance here. And I mean, it's a drug, and every drug is going to have side effects, some worse than others for different people. And so for some people, it's not going to make sense to take it based on their lifestyle and side effects they get. But for other people, I did a post on this where I talked about how much weight people lose on average. And so many people in the comments said, I've lost 100 pounds or I've lost 80 pounds or whatever it is.
Taking Mounjaro or something.
One of these GLP-1 mimetics. And again, going back to our conversation of big rocks, people worry about lean mass loss. They worry about, there was a study in, I think, rodents where they saw an increase in thyroid. I want to say thyroid cancer or something like that, but it was at not really a physiological dose. And again, it's rodents. People say, well, we don't know what the long-term effects of these drugs are. Well, they've actually been around for diabetes treatment for a couple of decades now. But, I mean, do we know what they do in 50 years? I guess not, but we know what obesity does. So I'm going to take Ron White's line, which is shoot the alligator closest to the boat. I think if somebody's very overweight or obese and they've tried a bunch of different methods and people say, well, they just haven't been consistent. Okay. So we can live in fantasy land or we can live in the real world, which is maybe some people just need some more training wheels than other people. Okay. If we could stop putting like an ethical judgment on how easy or hard it is for certain people to do certain things. I mean, it's easy for me to say, just be consistent because nutrition has never been a problem for me. I've never struggled with my weight. But I struggled in other areas of my life that why can't I just be more consistent? Why can't I just do the things I know I need to do? I'm sure you would feel the same way about certain things in your life where it's like, well, I know logically what to do, but it's hard for me to do it, right? And so if we look at the burden on the healthcare system of obesity and these type 2 diabetes and then all the metabolic diseases associated with them, it's hard for me to imagine a scenario where this is not a big net positive, to be quite frank. Now, this is, as my friend John Deloney says, it's both and, okay? Some people, this is really going to help them, and it should be done in concert with lifestyle changes and lifestyle education. Because we don't want people to go from eating a lot of a crappy diet to a little of a crappy diet, right? We want them to make better choices overall. But sometimes, again, habit coupling, people don't get motivated and then get results. People start getting results and then get motivated, right? And so a lot of times people will start losing weight and now they're motivated to go to the gym. They're motivated to eat better. It doesn't happen in a linear path. These things are kind of like the opposite of a vicious cycle where you're getting into a good cycle, right? And a lot of people tend to fall into these categories where when things go bad, they go really bad because it's a vicious cycle. When things go well, they go really well because it's a good cycle. And so what I would say is with the concerns about GLP-1s, the one I hear most is loss of lean mass. So in studies, people who use GLP-1 mimetics, they lose like 30 to 40% of the weight from lean mass, which is a concern. But by the way, that is similar to the amount of weight from lean mass people use who diet without resistance training or exercise. So I don't think that it's a unique problem to GLP-1s. And my guess is when we start getting studies that combine exercise with GLP-1s and look at lean mass retention, we'll probably see pretty similar results. So I'm not super worried about that. On a practical level, I can see some concern with it because if you don't have much appetite, you're usually not selecting protein as kind of your first, line of what you're going to pick. Mm-hmm. And additionally, fiber, you're not usually going to select as your first. So I think, again, these are great kind of like if we think about like training wheels, I think these are great training wheels for people. And through natural, just having less appetite, people start controlling their intake better. And then all these other habits start to fall into place for some people. And I talked to a friend who, she's a nurse practitioner, and she tried a GLP-1 mimetic just because she's like, I'm a nurse. I want to see what this stuff is like for me. And then she talked to a lot of her clients. And the anecdotal feedback that popped up a lot was it stopped the food noise in my head. I wasn't thinking about food all the time. I just stopped thinking about it so much. And if you look at obesity, I mean, again, it really is on the appetite side. We know that obese people have lower sensitivity to satiety signals. They get a greater reward from food. Like I just posted about a study the other day where they gave a milkshake to people and they didn't really see a dopamine response. But in people with binge eating disorder, when they give something like that, they do see a dopamine response. So a lot of it is contextual, right? And so I think a lot of it is contextual around obesity of, okay, these are people who get a greater reward from food on average. They're thinking about food more often. They've probably also dealt with people telling them in their entire life or however long that they need to lose weight. And so food is always on their mind in one thing or another. It's kind of like in Ghostbusters where they say, don't think about anything bad. What's the first thing you're going to do? You're going to think about something bad, right? And so trying to calm down food noise while knowing that you need to eat less food is probably pretty difficult. So on the whole, I think these drugs are positives. I think it's going to lower the healthcare burden. And I think it's going to help a lot of people. And the other thing I'll say is like, there's been a lot of pushback in the fitness industry by fitness influencers.
Why do you think that is? Like as if it's going to take their jobs away. It's like the same way that people fear AI. Like it's somehow like this stuff is here to stay. It benefits many, many people. I feel this way about these GLP-1 mimetics, and I feel the same way about AI. It's like these things could be, yes, potentially used for evil, but also for good.
If I think back about when I might have had that sort of reaction, I was in my early 20s, and that's when I thought obesity was a choice. I still think there is personal responsibility involved in obesity, but I think my feelings about obesity at that time were if somebody's obese, they're making the choice. They don't care about the stuff they eat, that mindfully they are choosing to eat these foods knowing this is going to be the outcome.
Like self-inflicted.
Yeah. And I don't think that's the case at all. I think a lot of people's habits and behaviors are on autopilot. I can remember very clearly, I dropped my kids off at school one day. I stopped at 7-Eleven to fill up with gas and like grab something from the store, a drink. And there was an obese woman in front of me, and she was getting 2 slices of pizza at 8 a.m. And at first I kind of had that knee-jerk response of, oh, so lazy, of course you're over. And then I thought, you know what? This is probably something she's done for a long time. This is probably a very habit where she goes to a 7-Eleven, she gets pizza. Or on Tuesday morning at 8 a.m., she's around this area and she goes to 7-Eleven and gets pizza. And maybe not, but I think a lot of people out there are like that, where their habits and behaviors are very much on autopilot. It's not this mindfulness that we think they're doing. And that translates into other areas. And the other thing I realized is I'm like, it can't be laziness, like all of it, because there's obese people who are very successful in other areas of their life. So they know how to work hard. Mm-hmm. And so, at least not for everybody, that can't be the explanation. And I think with fitness influencers or people who have, actually they've worked hard, they've built a good physique, it's almost like, how dare you get results without doing it yourself? I did this without any help, And the reality is, you might have had help because your upbringing might have not been food focused. You might not have had a mother who was always on you about food, or you might not have had parents who shamed you if you didn't clean your plate. You might have had genetics that made you more sensitive to satiety signals. You might have had a phenotype where if you overeat, you tend to just become spontaneously more active. That's part of the obese resistant phenotype. And so you might have had an advantage and you just didn't realize it. So I think if we could just get away from the judgment of stuff and take the judgment, all that stuff out of it. Does this seem to help people, and is it going to be a net positive on society? Thomas Sowell said, in order to make compassionate policy, you have to have dispassionate analysis of the data. And the data says this is going to be massive for our society, and it's a huge benefit. So regardless of my personal feelings of, hey, somebody should be able to look at Ethan Suplee, lost 300 pounds doing it through all hard work and exercise. I'm pretty sure I've talked to Ethan about this, and he said, I think this is great, because it's hard to get people to believe if people believe what they can see. And so if they start seeing results, then they can buy in. And yeah, I think overall it's a net positive. So, maybe studies will come out in 10 years and people are falling over dead from this stuff and we'll say, oh, whoopsies. But you have to shoot the alligator closest to the boat. And right now, the biggest burden on our healthcare system, I think I'm correct in saying this, and the biggest threat in a lot of ways is how metabolically unhealthy our society is getting.
Yeah, I think also when people hear about these drugs, they think about the person who's slightly overweight or who is already fit, who wants to be even thinner.
Yeah.
And that's not what we're talking about here. And I have a good friend who is an air traffic controller. He works very, very hard, very stressful job, obviously, high consequence job. And he's very overweight. He's got to be more than 300 pounds by a significant margin. And he's really struggled over the years. And for years, he talked about getting his, quote unquote, stomach stapled, that's sometimes referred to that way. Couldn't afford the surgery, this sort of thing. And I asked him about it. I was like, what's that about? And he's like, I just need something that's going to allow me to move without pain or a little bit less pain. Every time he tries exercising, he injures himself. Yeah. And he's probably going about that incorrectly, but he doesn't have a lot of time. And he literally has lives in his hands. He's married now. He may have kids soon. So I haven't spoken to him recently about these drugs, but to me, it seems like that's like the perfect candidate for these drugs. If he could eat less with more ease and lose some weight and then also start exercising, I think that'd be a significant win for him. So scenarios like that are what I think of. And then also, it's a mostly free world in many places, not all. So if people can afford these things and they want to take them, like who am I to say they shouldn't take them? I just I feel like the amount of judgment involved to say that somebody should or should not use a drug is that's safe and potentially helpful for them is like kind of that's almost offensive in a way.
Yeah, if you had something that, like, if we came out with a drug and it's like, it looks like for a lot of people this can fix opioid addiction, right?
Yeah, you'd give them that drug.
We'd be shouting from the rooftops and celebrating, right? We wouldn't say, well, you just got to gut it out and work harder. You just got to want it more. It's like, no, like there is some personal responsibility there, and there are choices and things that can be made. But why are we trying to make this barrier so high for people? Like, let's lower this barrier.
I love that. On the other side of the coin, you've been pretty vocal elsewhere about the fact that sugar is not a drug.
Yeah.
Because sometimes people will say, sugar is a drug. I would sort of put in the soft argument from my side, that highly processed foods, or let's just call them high density of taste foods, right? That combine, processed carbohydrates and fats, at high heats that can be consumed in, where you can easily consume several thousand calories at,
right.
almost unconsciously, right? I mean, unless you're asleep or in a coma, you can just pop these things in your mouth and keep going. I don't even know if they taste that good, but people just keep going. That there's a bit of kind of lack of awareness and compulsivity to them. Very different than addiction, of course, because people aren't necessarily going out and robbing people. But maybe just touch on your view of sugar as a substance. We're not talking about the sugar in fruit. We're talking about candy, ice creams, desserts, quote unquote hidden sugars.
Yeah.
What are the real risks of these things if people are consuming them still within the confines of their daily caloric needs? So they're not eating excess calories. What's the deal with sugar?
Okay, so this is where it's very important to give the appropriate context and nuance. And I'm glad you set it up the way you did. So I always tell people when it comes to almost anything, have guidelines, not hard rules, because hard rules will get you to do things that are kind of dumb, right? So for example, if you say, I'm never going to eat processed foods. Well, whey protein is processed, but if you look at the data on whey protein, it improves metabolic health, it increases lean mass, body composition, even lowers inflammation. So, I mean, if we're just going to say all processed foods are bad, well, isn't then whey bad? So guidelines in that nature. Same thing for sugar, because obviously, okay, well, added sugar it doesn't have a big satiety benefit. It's calorically dense, makes food very palatable. I'm going to come back to that because it's contextual. But fruit has sugar, and biochemically, not really that different. I mean, if you're talking about sucrose, okay, it's a molecule of glucose and fructose. Okay, a lot of fruits have glucose and fructose in them, right? So if sugar has some inherent lipogenic, biochemical toxicity, addictive quality, whatever, we should see similar effects across different sources of sugar. And we don't see that, right? And even when it comes to some of the processed foods, people don't realize what goes into making something hyper palatable is complex. It's not just sugar. It's not just fat. It's not just sodium. It's texture, mouthfeel. You mentioned temperature. All these things matter. And in fact, there was actually a study a while back that suggested that texture might actually make a bigger impact on the palatability of a food than even the sugar content.
Interesting.
And let's take it more from a mechanistic level, from your example. If you're in the confines of your calories, what happens? I would say a high sugar diet is still not ideal because it's going to be hard to get enough fiber in a high sugar diet. But long time ago, beginning of grad school, I was under the opinion that sugar and high fructose corn syrup were calorie per calorie, more fattening, metabolically unhealthy. Now, I was at a graduate mixer with a professor named Manny Nakamura, who was at Illinois, and he had done some of the feeding studies in rats with fructose and seen these weird metabolic effects, right? And I overheard him having a conversation with another professor, and I was shocked by what he said, because he's the one that did some of this research. And the other professor said, so, high fructose corn syrup is bad and fructose is bad. He goes, no, it's really just the calories that are in it. It's easy to overconsume. People consume it through soda and, they just eat too much. And the guy was like, well, you showed all these things in these mice. He goes, we fed them like over 50% of their calories were from pure fructose. That's pretty much impossible to get through the diet unless like you're literally doing nothing but drinking soda. And he said, we showed a pathway, but that's not practical in terms of like the application to humans. And so I got curious. I really started going down the literature on sugar, trying to say, is he right about this? Is it really not, calorie per calorie more damaging than non-sugar carbohydrate? When you look at sugar intake, it is associated with increased levels of inflammation. It's associated with obesity, but there are what we call confounding variables, which is people who eat a lot of sugar tend to eat a lot of calories. So if we look at, here's my favorite, human randomized control trials where we control total calorie intake and sugar intake, what do we see? And probably the best example of this was a study from Surwitt back in, I want to say 1997. And the reason I'm going to pick out this study is because it had the best controls in it. So they provided all the food to participants. The protein, carbohydrates, and fats were all the same. I think it was a 1,200 calorie diet. And they provided all these meals for 6 weeks and looked at fat loss and some blood lipids and those sorts of things. And they found that, so one group was getting over 100 grams of sugar a day. I think it was it was based on some like body weight and energy expenditure stuff, but I think it was around like 110 grams of sucrose per day, right? A lot of sugar. Other group, like around 10. So 10 times different sugar. And at the end of the study, there was no difference in fat loss. There was no difference in lean mass retention. There was no difference in almost any marker they looked at. The only difference they saw, all the blood markers improved. The only difference they saw was that LDL cholesterol improved a little bit better in the low sugar group. And that is probably a function of the fact that the low sugar group had more fiber. We know fiber can bind to cholesterol and lower LDL cholesterol in the blood. So when I saw that, I was like, oh, man. And then when I looked through all these other studies with similar kind of controls, they pretty much show the same thing across the board on metabolic health, on inflammation. Like inflammation really isn't different if calories are controlled with high sugar versus low sugar, as long as you're getting enough fiber.
What about feelings of satiety? Because
well, that is the real downside. If you're eating if you're eating a 1,200 calorie diet and 400 calories are coming from pure sugar, I mean, you're probably going to be kind of hungry, right?
Yeah, I'd be extremely hungry. I mean, I consume artificial sweeteners for the record,
right?
But there are enough data, and I have enough experience with them to know that sometimes they will curb my appetite, like they'll get me over the bump. Mm-hmm. But I've come to associate, it's probably just pure paired placebo association, if there is such a thing, where if I drink a Diet Coke, pretty soon after that, I want to eat something. Mm-hmm. Now, I've challenged that by not eating something because I have pretty good discipline, and it passes. But I think I've come to associate the sweet taste with wanting to eat something. And nothing to me is more delicious. Well, there are many things. Like a Diet Coke and a slice of pizza if I'm in New York, or a Diet Coke and a burger, or there are these food associations.
Right.
But I don't think, for instance, that sweet taste necessarily stimulates appetite. But I can imagine if I only had, as you said, 1,200 calories a day to eat, and I'm getting 400 of those calories from sugar, like you said, there's not going to be much. I better be eating a lot of broccoli as well, or else I'm going to be pretty hungry. Just based on my learned relationships between sweet taste and food consumption.
What I tell people is I would focus less on like sugar intake. I mean, if you want to focus on added sugars, that's fine. Focus on calories, protein, and your fiber content, right? Because if you're getting enough fiber, it's going to be hard to eat a lot of junk doing that, right? And when we look at the sugar intake and calorie levels, all that kind of stuff, actually a great example would be the case of Dr. Mark Haub. Are you familiar with him? He's at Kansas State. He's a nutrition professor. In 2011, he got the name the Twinkie Diet Professor. I'm not sure if you saw this, but
but I know about the Twinkie defense.
Right. So he asked his students what they thought mattered more for fat loss, the calories you eat or the food choices you make. And most of them said food choices. And he said, okay, let's do an experiment. Do you think if I do an 1,800 calorie diet from ultra processed foods exclusively, that I will lose weight and get healthier? And most of the students said no. And so for 12 weeks, he ate 1,800 calories. He called it originally the 7-Eleven diet. He basically is like, if I couldn't get it at the 7-Eleven, I didn't eat it. Now the caveat is he had a multivitamin and he had some whey protein so that he was getting enough protein, because it's hard to get protein from some of those ultra processed foods. But 1,800 calories, and he lost 27 pounds, and all of his blood markers improved and his insulin sensitivity improved. Now, that seems crazy to a lot of people, but for those people who have worked and looked at blood work with weight loss and whatnot, I mean, it's not that surprising. That is one of the biggest levers for metabolic health. And so when they asked him afterwards, what a great diet. Like, you could eat all this junk food. And he goes, well, not really. Like, it's 1,800 calories of junk food. It goes really fast. I was pretty hungry, and honestly, like, first week it was like, oh, this is kind of nice. And then after that, I was like, I'd really like just a really big salad, just something satiating. So again, no solutions, only trade-offs. There is a benefit to being able to go, well, if I can fit into my calories, it's okay, as long as I get enough fiber and protein. Yeah, the trade-off is it's a high budget cost, right? Same thing with people's, the data on like moderate alcohol consumption shows that it doesn't impede fat loss. It doesn't, if you account for the calories in it. But I'll tell people, like, hey, do you really, like, if you have like 2 craft beers, do you really want to spend 400 or 500 calories on like 24 ounces of fluid that's not going to impact your satiety at all? And so I think a lot of people view this through a very black and white lens, right? Where it's like, oh, Lane says, or this person says, I can eat sugar and lose fat, so I can eat as much sugar as I want. No, because there are practical limits to this, right? But take somebody like me, right? If my calorie intake is my budget, I train 2-3 hours a day. My maintenance calories are anywhere from 3,300 to 3,400 calories a day, which is a not crazy amount, but a healthy amount for somebody of my size. I have a decent sized budget, right? If I can still get my protein in, get my fiber, hit my micronutrient targets, and I have calories left over for energy filler, sure. Just like if somebody makes $1 million a year and they want to go buy a sports car, it's not a great investment. It's not a good investment at all. Why wouldn't they just bank every single cent they make? Well, because maybe for them, having that little reward motivates them to keep doing what they're doing and making that level of money, right? But if you're making, let's take loans out of it, right? If you're making $100,000 a year, does it make sense to spend $90,000 on a sports car if it means you can't pay your mortgage and you can't save money for retirement, you can't meet your obligations? No, it doesn't make sense, right? And so if you're a small woman, small lean mass-wise, who is trying to lose some weight, does it make sense if you're eating 1,200 calories a day to lose weight to spend 300 calories of that on some ultra-processed junk food? I don't think it does. But if you're an Olympic athlete who's burning 4,000 or 5,000 calories a day, good luck eating that level of calories from good, minimally processed foods. You're going to feel full all the time.
There does seem to be a kind of a requirement in books, in sometimes even in podcasts, or to take a stance, like to be anti-something. Yeah. Because saying, what I personally believe based on my read of the data is that most people should strive to get anywhere from 70 to 90% of their food from non-processed, minimally processed quality foods, and then allow some space for the, some processed food, highly processed foods and sweets and things like that, but mostly to get the macros right, as we've described them earlier. And what the range will depend on age, will depend on activity level, will depend on prior health history. I mean, there's some people who have enough issues that relate to diet and lack of exercise that when I've seen them get it right and undergo such incredible transformations that, like, I also know these people's capacity to fall off the train.
Right.
And you want to say, maybe make that number 100% so you never go back, because I've seen them slip before and then the guilt and then they come back, So there are two ways to look at it. One is you tell people, listen, you don't have to be perfect, right? Because if perfection is the goal, you're going to fall off. But then there are those individuals like severe alcoholics who quit drinking. You don't say like, hey, like you can have a beer on Christmas. You don't say that, right? It's all or none. But anyway, here we're getting into the psychology of it.
But I think that that's what you're saying right there is that's where the individualization comes in, right? Like it's contextually dependent and it's dependent on the individual and what makes sense for them. And I think we, as people, if we find something that works for us, we're a little bit too quick to want to evangelize everyone else around us because we do want to help. We do have good intentions for the most part, and we overgeneralize. And for me, again, like counting macros, flexible dieting, when I dealt with a little bit of binge eating when I was young, when I first got into bodybuilding because I was trying to, eat clean. And I was in college, so my buddies would order pizza or whatever, and I ended up eating like an entire pizza by myself, right? And so once I allowed myself to just have the foods I wanted in moderation, I just got brutally consistent, right? So that for me, that was the switch that flipped. But other people, that may not be the right solution. And I think we make a bunch of, that diet worked for me. We assume physiology, when actually I think it's much more psychology and just trips that compliance algorithm in somebody's head and it makes sense. And if we could just be willing to say more often, hey, this is what I do, but I like this and you don't have to do it. Maybe try it.
Yeah. Oh, and everyone struggles with different things and everyone finds certain things easier. Like I'm not an alcoholic. I'm an adult, so I can have a drink or two. I just don't like it. So everyone assumes because I did this episode on alcohol that I'm like anti-alcohol. Like I'm like, if you're an adult, you're non-alcoholic, you don't have issues with alcohol use disorder or something, like you might guess, like just know the data, right? But there are certain things like steak, I'm never giving up. Like you could tell me it takes 10 years off my life and I'm not going to give it up. I'll do other things to offset whatever and that decrease in longevity might be. I don't think that's a real thing. But I'm just not going to give it up. It's central to my enjoyment of life. Yeah. Period. Speaking of which, if one really wants to wade into the waters of strong opinions and conflicting data, we covered this a bit last time you were on the podcast, but the questions were replete with requests to discuss seed oils.
I'm sure.
Seed oils. And I must say, this whole thing about seed oils has really gotten in my head. Even though I'm a scientist, like the other day I went to my sister's for dinner and she made a really nice dinner. It was for our mom's birthday. And then she made a really nice salad, and I love fruits and vegetables, so it was like salad. And then I looked and I was like, she's made this salad with like grapeseed oil. And I was like, why'd you use grapeseed oil instead of olive oil? And she's like, well, I ran out of olive oil. And I found myself like looking at the salad like, is this safe to eat? And I was like, I heard your voice in my ear. I also heard Paul's voice in my ear. Saladinos, all these people. And I thought, well, I ate the salad, by the way. I really enjoyed it. It was good. Grapeseed oil doesn't taste as good to me as olive oil. Yeah. I generally try and use olive oil, butter, things like that when I cook. But what's the deal with seed oils? I understand that they are calorically dense. You told us that last time. I understand people tend to overconsume them and then blame them for a bunch of things that are not related to their seed oilness rather than their calorie containingness. These aren't real words, of course, but you get the idea. But are there any data out there that have your ears kind of pricked up to the possibility that, assuming equal calories, that there might be something bad about seed oils, or is there zero? And there's no pressure here to answer one way or the other. Not that you would respond to pressure from me anyway.
So I think it's all about making the appropriate apples to apples comparison, right? Because if we're looking at addition studies of, adding something to a diet, adding omega-6s, linoleic acid, whatever. Well, if you're adding those, you're adding calories, which is a confounding variable, right? So ideally what the real question is, because the debate tends to be the people who are anti-seed oil tend to be very pro-saturated fat. And so the question really is, okay, if we swap out these things in a 1-to-1 ratio, what is the outcome, right? So not like when outcome, I mean metabolic health, inflammation, those sorts of things. So in the studies, I have yet to find a good human randomized control trial where they give polyunsaturated fat in place of saturated fat, exchange at a 1-to-1 ratio, and see negative, actual outcomes.
What about swapping with monounsaturated fats? Like why are we talking about seed oils versus lard and butter? Why aren't we talking about seed oils versus olive oil? And I'm a professor of neurobiology and ophthalmology at Stanford School of Medicine. Today, my guest is Dr. Gina Poe. Dr. Gina Poe is a professor in the Department of Integrative Biology and Physiology at the University of California, Los Angeles. Her laboratory and research focuses on the relationship between sleep and learning, in particular how specific patterns of brain activity that are present during specific phases of sleep impact our ability to learn and remember specific types of information. For instance, procedural information, that is, how to perform specific cognitive or physical tasks, as well as encoding of emotional memories and discarding emotional memories. Indeed, her research focuses on how specific phases of sleep can act as its own form of trauma therapy, discarding the emotional tones of memories. In addition, her laboratory focuses on how specific phases of sleep impact things like the release of growth hormone. Growth hormone, of course, plays critical roles in metabolism and tissue repair, including brain tissue repair, and therefore has critical roles in vitality and longevity. Today, you will learn many things about the relationship between sleep, learning, emotionality, and growth hormone. One basic but very important takeaway that you'll learn about today, which was news to me, is that it's not just the duration and depth of your sleep that matter, but actually getting to sleep at relatively the same time each night ensures that you get adequate growth hormone release in the first hours of sleep. In fact, if you require, let's say, 8 hours of sleep per night, but you go to sleep 2 hours later than your typical bedtime on any given night, you actually miss the window for growth hormone release. That's right. Getting growth hormone release in sleep, which is absolutely critical to our immediate and long-term health, is not a prerequisite of getting sleep, even if we are getting enough sleep. As Dr. Poe explains, there are critical brain circuits and endocrine, that is hormone circuits, that regulate not just the duration and depth and quality and timing of sleep, but when we place our bout of sleep, that is when we go to sleep each night, plus or minus about a half hour or so, strongly dictates whether or not we will experience all the health-promoting, including mind-promoting benefits of sleep. Today's episode covers that and a lot more in substantial detail. You will learn, for instance, how to use sleep in order to optimize learning, as well as forgetting for those things that you would like to forget. So during today's episode, Dr. Gina Poe shares critical information about not just neuroscience, but physiology and the hormone systems of the brain and body that strongly inform mental health, physical health, and performance. So by the end of today's episode, you'll be far more informed about sleep and how it works, the different roles it performs, and you will have several new actionable steps that you can take in order to improve your mental health, physical health, and performance. Before we begin, I'd like to emphasize that this podcast is separate from my teaching and research roles at Stanford. It is, however, part of my desire and effort to bring zero cost to consumer information about science and science-related tools to the general public. In keeping with that theme, I'd like to thank the sponsors of today's podcast. Our first sponsor is Element. Element is an electrolyte drink that has everything you need and nothing you don't. That means plenty of salt, magnesium, and potassium, the so-called electrolytes, and no sugar. Now, the electrolytes are critical to the function of every cell in your body, in particular the neurons, the nerve cells. As I've talked about before on this podcast, neurons, nerve cells, require adequate sodium and potassium, as well as magnesium, in order to fire action potentials, which are the electrical signals that allow neurons to do everything from generate focus and attention, allow you to learn, and generate neuromuscular connection, and allow you to exercise or train or do any kind of skilled activity with a high degree of output. I take Element about 2 or 3 times per day, typically once in the morning and again after or during my bout of exercise each day, and sometimes an additional one if I've sat in a hot sauna and sweat a lot or if the weather is very hot. If you'd like to try Element, you can go to drinkelement, that's lmnt.com/Huberman, to claim a free Element sample pack with your purchase. Again, that's drinkelement, lmnt.com/Huberman, to claim a free sample pack. Today's episode is also brought to us by Helix Sleep. Helix Sleep makes mattresses and pillows that are of the absolute highest quality. Now, sleep is the foundation of mental health, physical health, and performance. When we are sleeping well, all of those things excel. And when we are not sleeping well, all of those things suffer. Now, the surface that you sleep on, that is the mattress that you sleep on, is critical. And Helix understands that everybody has slightly different sleep needs. So if you were to go to the Helix site, which I invite you to do, and take their brief 2-minute quiz, it will match your body type and sleep preferences to the perfect mattress for you. It will ask you questions, for instance, do you sleep on your back or your side or your stomach? Do you tend to run hot or cold during the night? Or maybe you don't know the answers to those questions. I went and took the sleep quiz at Helix, and it matched me to the so-called Dusk mattress, D-U-S-K. I started sleeping on a Dusk mattress over a year ago, and it's the best sleep that I've ever had. It's completely transformed the depth and duration and quality of my sleep in ways that make me feel far better during the daytime. If you're interested in upgrading your mattress, you can go to helixsleep.com/Huberman, take their 2-minute sleep quiz, and they'll match you to a customized mattress, and you'll get up to $350 off any mattress order and 2 free pillows. Again, if interested, go to helixsleep.com/Huberman for up to $350 off and 2 free pillows. Today's episode is also brought to us by 8 Sleep. 8 Sleep makes smart mattress covers with cooling, heating, and sleep tracking capacity. Now, again, sleep is the foundation of mental health, physical health, and performance. But what many people don't realize is that in order to fall and stay asleep, your core body temperature has to drop by about 1 to 3 degrees. Conversely, in order to wake up each morning and feel refreshed, your body temperature actually has to increase by 1 to 3 degrees. Therefore, controlling the temperature of your sleeping environment is absolutely key. With 8 Sleep, that's very easy to do. Depending on whether or not you typically run too cold or too hot during the night, you can program your 8 Sleep mattress cover so that it's the optimal temperature, not just for you, but for each phase, the early, middle, and late phase of your sleep, and for waking up in the morning. In fact, you can even control the temperature of your 8 Sleep mattress cover differentially across the mattress if you're sleeping alongside somebody else. If you'd like to try 8 Sleep, you can go to 8sleep.com/Huberman and check out their Pod Pro cover and save $150 at checkout. 8 Sleep currently ships in the USA, Canada, UK, and select countries in the EU and Australia. Again, that's 8sleep.com/Huberman to save $150 at checkout. The Huberman Lab podcast is now partnered with Momentous Supplements. To find the supplements we discuss on the Huberman Lab podcast, you can go to Live Momentous, spelled O-U-S, livemomentous.com/Huberman. And I should just mention that the library of those supplements is constantly expanding. Again, that's livemomentous.com/Huberman. And now for my discussion with Dr. Gina Poe. Dr. Gina Poe, welcome.
Thank you.
I've really been looking forward to this conversation because I'm familiar with your work, and I know that many people are going to be excited to learn about your work as it relates to sleep, as it relates to problem solving, creativity, addiction and craving, relapse, and a number of other important topics. So to start things off, I would love for you to educate us a bit about this thing that we are all familiar with, and yet very few of us understand, which is sleep. And if you would, could you describe the various phases of sleep that exist, what distinguish them, and perhaps frame this within the context of what would a perfect night's sleep look like?
Okay.
How long would it last, more or less?
Mm-hmm.
And what would the biology look like? What is a perfect night's sleep?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. All right. So sleep is really different from wakefulness, and in fact, can't be replaced by any state of wakefulness that we've been able to come up with so far. Our brain chemistry is completely different, and in the different stages of sleep, which is non-REM and REM are the 2 major states of sleep, and every animal we've studied so far seems to have both of those states. Anyway, those 2 states are entirely different from one another too, and even within non-REM, there are 3 states. Stage 1, which is what you slip into when you're first falling asleep, it's dozing. There's kind of an interesting rhythm that goes on in the brain. It's kind of a fast gamma rhythm. And then there's stage 2, which is a really cool state. We sort of used to ignore sleep researchers because it was a transient state between wakefulness and the deep stage 3 slow wave sleep, which is the most impressively different. And then, and between that and REM sleep. So stage 2, I'll talk a little bit more about. And then the deep slow wave sleep state, which is when big slow waves sweep through our brain. And now we realize that it cleans our brain. One of the things that those big slow waves do is cleans our brain and does other really important things to restore us from a day of wakefulness. And then REM sleep, which is the most popular because that's where we have the most active dreams. And when you wake up someone out of REM sleep, they'll almost always report having dreamed something really bizarre. That's called REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep. So those are the 4 states of sleep, of human sleep, and we cycle through them every 90 minutes or so. When we go to sleep, say 10, 10:30, 11 o'clock, Our first REM sleep period comes about 105 minutes after we fall asleep and lasts about 20 minutes. Actually, it comes about 95 minutes and lasts 10 or 15 minutes. And then we start over again. And we have about 5 of those per night for a perfect night's sleep, 4 or 5, something like that. So a perfect night's sleep is 7.5, 8 hours. There was a really great study that put people in a semi-darkened room with nothing but the bed for 12 hours every day for a month. And what people did initially is because we're in a sleep-deprived nation, is that they slept a lot more than usual, like